afternoon, everyone. Today we have a very interesting topic on perspectives on global development 2014, boosting productivity to meet the middle income challenge. And we have very interesting persons who are going to give us some new perspective on the global development. Please join me in welcoming Federico Bonaglia, Deputy Director, and Martin Wermelinger, excuse my German, Economist from OECD Development Center. Please, Federico.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your kind hospitality, for welcoming us here. It's a pleasure to be at TDRI. Let me briefly introduce myself and our center before giving you a little bit of the key messages of the report that we are presenting today, and Martin, who is one of the main authors of the report, will then drive you through the hard stuff, the real stuff. But before beginning, let me say that at the OECD, we receive trainings about presentations. How do you make an effective presentation? So they tell us, if you do a presentation in the United States, you have to start with a joke. But if you do a presentation in Japan, you have to start by apologizing. And I think I missed the class where they taught us how you start a presentation in Thailand. So I will start my presentation by apologizing for not having a joke. And I hope that you will excuse if I don't respect the local way of starting. So, a little bit of background. I am the Deputy Director of the Development Center of the OECD. The OECD, as you may know, is an organization that brings together about 40 governments that are committed to share their experiences and to improve their policies. The Development Center is a particular body within the OECD for two reasons. The first one is that we do not look at specific policies by sector. We don't look at only, let's say, education or labor or trade or investment. We look at development, and development is cross-sectoral. It's not a policy, it's a process that involves many policies. So we look at policies for development. It may include looking at skills, it may include looking at investment, but we look at all of those things. The second specificity about the Development Center is that while the OECD is made of, let's say, developed countries, or high-income countries, mostly high-income countries, the Development Center has the specificity of welcoming on its board also countries that are not OECD ones. So as of today, the center has 18 countries that are developing countries, including Thailand. We have other countries like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, South Africa, Morocco, Egypt, Senegal, Brazil, Argentina, and many others, up to 18. And so this is the specificity. We do research across policy areas, and we promote policy dialogue across governments so that we can exchange experiences, what works, what doesn't work in specific areas. Now, this report that we are presenting here today is the fourth in a series that is the fourth in a series where we look at a phenomenon that we call shifting wealth. The first one that we did in 2010, it was about understanding the emergence of large middle-income countries, large developing countries like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and others, and trying to understand how the emergence of these countries was impacting on global economic trends and on developing countries. And as you will see in the presentation, we realized that the emergence of these countries is driving a lot of the convergence in per capita incomes from developing countries toward, let's say, higher income countries. So once we established that this phenomenon was taking place, because at the time not everybody was convinced that there was a change in the economic center of gravity of the economy that has basically moved from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Many speaks of the Asia century for this reason. Once we realized that, once we established and we got the artifacts that phenomenon was taking place, we asked ourselves, okay, but what are the implications of this changing global scenario on development? And so a following report in 2011 looked at the issue of social cohesion, because we were realizing that in many countries, people were escaping from extreme poverty. They were joining, let's say, what you can call a middle income sector or a middle class, though it's not clear what the middle class means in that domain. But at the same time, they were remaining vulnerable. So you are above the extreme poverty line, but if something happened to you, like you lose your job, or there is a death in the family, or there is a natural disaster, or whatever, you fall back into poverty. And so we were saying, we were trying to understand how can you design approaches that help to cope with the vulnerability of these middle classes and to promote social cohesion. That was the second report. The third report that we did the following year was about the production side. So in 2011, we look at the, let's say, social side. On 2013, we look at the production side. And we look in particular at the role of industrial policy and policies for building production capabilities in developing countries, and how different countries around the world are experimenting with different approaches. So the natural follow-up to those reports is this one, because we realized that a fundamental driver of the convergence process or of the lack of convergence is productivity. So you need to understand what drives productivity growth, and the productivity and the social agenda are very much related one to the other. Because as you know also from the experience in this country, once you have citizens that evolve toward, let's say, middle class between brackets, they get aspirations. They have aspiration to get better jobs, better standard of living, more accountable government, more effective public services. And so if you don't create the jobs for these people will find other ways, exit, as Hirschman was saying, of voicing and exiting from the social contract, and they will start increasing social tensions. So the productivity agenda and the social agenda, in our view, are very much related. This report here, I mean, Martin will guide you through this, but it has basically three messages. The first one is that if you look at the historical performance of developing countries and emerging economies, they have done a great deal of catching up, as economic theory would suggest. You start from low levels of capital and labor utilization, you grow quite rapidly, quite fast. However, even if this strong rate of growth was to be maintained, our calculation suggests that countries that are today in the middle income bracket, like Thailand, that increased from lower middle income to upper middle income in 2011, I think, or 2012, even if the growth rate observed over the last 10 years had to be maintained, that rate would not be enough for a country like Thailand. Actually, Thailand maybe is a borderline case, but for many middle-income countries, it will not be enough to reach high-income status by 2050. So how do you sustain this process of convergence? Well, you need to change your growth model. You need to move from what we can call intrinsic type of growth, which is based on factor accumulation and moving resources from less productive uses to more productive uses on allocations. You need to move from that type of model to a model where growth is driven by innovation, knowledge, skills, and better total factor productivity. So better ways of organizing the factor of production. This is the second message. So convergence going on, but not enough speed to reach high income status by 2050. A major culprit is productivity. You need to change the growth model and increase productivity. The third question, the million dollar question, is how do you do it? And here, as we will show, we have a number of recommendations, 4 or 5 recommendations, that are not mutually exclusive. They actually can be applicable depending on the context as a kind of menu. So there are a few recommendations, and then there are a few other ingredients. The first one is you need effective institutions, effective and inclusive institutions. The second one is that you need to deepen the regional integration process in this region. And the third one, oh my God, I got a little, so you need institutions, good institutions. You need to deepen regional integration, and you need to look at what other countries did. Peer learning. You need to exchange experiences with other countries and learn from other countries. And here we conclude, this is exactly where the OECD can help Thailand and other countries, because we bring together countries that have gone through very different development trajectories, they went through different approaches. If you bring together Brazil and Germany, or Denmark and Morocco, as we do in the Development Center, you clearly have quite a diverse set of experiences and approaches, some more conventional than others. But we believe that by bringing around the table these people and exchanging the how do you make reform happen is the real value added of the OECD. So we're very proud to have Thailand as a member of the Development Center. We're very proud also to cooperate with a research institution like the DRI. And I hope that you will enjoy the presentation that Martin will deliver in much better way than I can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Federico, for this introduction. So this is the report, and following up from the key messages that he provided, I spanned them to 6 key messages, from 3 to 6. So let me give them very quickly. The first one is shifting weight of global economic activity. It continues in 2013, but the lower growth prospects challenge continued convergence. The growth slowdowns at the middle income level are often associated with productivity slowdowns. So as Federico highlighted, we need to look at productivity, and in the report we focus at very detailed productivity analysis at the firm level for the 6 BRICS economies, including Indonesia, plus 3 other emerging economies. Unfortunately, we didn't have firm level data for Thailand, so we couldn't include Thailand. And also look at sectoral productivity analysis, efficiency analysis, and markup analysis. So we go into that and really want to understand which kind of firms are more productive, what makes them more successful than others, and so on. Now, as Federico also said, the old drivers of growth and productivity are sometimes fading. It depends on the country, of course, but in many of the middle-income countries, for example, the absorption of labor is already past, so they have to find, and this is point 4, to find new drivers of productivity for the future. And I want to adapt this presentation very much to the situation of Thailand, although it's not specifically covered in the report, but I still tried to take the key messages out and what is relevant for Thailand. And given that the absorption of labor has already happened in Thailand, and a lot of other particularities, we believe that improving education and skills is one of the key things to address, and developing productive services. And there would be other things like infrastructure and so on, but I want to focus on these 2 in this presentation. The 5th key message then is you need to be inclusive and sustainable. If you do focus on these 2 factors, we believe also that this will lead to more inclusive and sustainable development, because services are less energy intensive. Services sometimes make production processes more efficient, and introduce new technologies through these services. So this will lead to more sustainable, environmentally friendly development. But then in the end, the 6th key message, and this is a very crucial one, a very difficult one, is the institutions, the capability to implement all the things that we analyze. I mean, we can have a lot of suggestions what you should do, but in the end, what really matters is whether the government, together with all the stakeholders, is really able to implement the reforms and this in a sustainable way. So let me go through the 6 messages in a bit more detail. So the first one was about the shifting economic landscape. You see, this line here is the share of non-OECD economies in the world, and the black line is the share of OECD. So this is bad news for the OECD, because actually now non-OECD world has already surpassed the level of the OECD. But it actually means that, yeah, there is really a shifting wealth, and this involves new challenges, and this continues. Actually, this interaction was in 2010, according to the new PPP figures that have been just released. I don't know, did I grab something? If you remember the graph, we had also the shares of the different BRICS economies, and actually we see that the share of China, I mean, we all know that China has grown a lot, and they have become more important. But it's really quite striking how much. In the 90s, they had like 2% or less of global GDP. Now it's above 10%. So this is quite significant. Now, so there is a slide where you see the differential rate of growth in the OECD economies versus the non-OECD economies. Maybe I get a copy too, then I see which slide number it is. Is that fine? Right. This picture, I mean, it's for the whole world basically, how growth between the two groups is moving on. But we see that recently the differential rate has actually decreased quite significantly. And what does that mean if this is going forward? It means that exactly the convergence in per capita incomes in developing countries with advanced countries is going to slow down, and this involves more difficulties for the catch-up. The same thing holds when we look at the figures for Thailand. Actually, the growth rates over time since the 90s have been going down. So you also actually see this slowing down in economic growth in Thailand. So Federico announced this comparison whether Thailand is going to converge by 2050. So there, on the horizontal axis, we show the average growth rate from 2000 to 2012 in the different countries, and on the vertical axis we show what growth rate would be needed for these countries to converge by 2050. So above the 45-degree line, countries need to accelerate compared to what they have experienced in the past. When they are below, they are actually fine, and they would converge by 2050. Now, this is a very simple analysis and a simple stylized fact, but I mean, obviously, if China, for example, is slowing down, the growth prospects of a lot of other countries will be affected too. So we can't make clear references whether they are going to make it or not. But still, what we can see is that there are a lot of countries, the blue ones that are in the upper middle income bracket, that have been at that level for a while, like Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, and so on. And they seem to have difficulty. Even these countries will not make it in the next 35 years if they are going to continue growing like
Martin, could you tell us where Thailand is in this map?
Yeah, Thailand is here, the red one. And actually Thailand, as Federico also said, is kind of just making it. But I mean, as I said, it's just a simple science fact, and we know this is the analysis until 2012. I mean, we know that in 2013 and 14 things have happened, growth has slowed down, and it's not quite sure how it's going to continue. So we cannot make full reference of it, but it seems some countries, if they are going to continue as they did in the past, still have problems. And remember, this was a period where emerging economies have grown quite fast, like due to the rise of China. So even with that, Thailand is just making it, and a lot of other countries are not making it. So this was stylized fact. Is it going stylized fact 1 or key message 1? There is still shifting of wealth, but okay. But it's not like its prospects for continued convergence is unclear. So now, that's why, I mean, given key message 2, that growth slowdowns are often associated with productivity slowdowns, this is something that we analyzed by growth decompositions from on the supply side, but also on the demand side. But on the supply side, we see that when we get the residual, which is productivity, and this productivity has slowed down in many of these countries. So now we look at that's basically the motivation why we think, and we want to look at very detailed productivity factors. Let me just give you one figure for that purpose, and it's unfortunately you don't have that figure yet, because I mean in the overall report Thailand was not included, and that's why I did some additional work to get the feeling for you where Thailand is positioned. So I did GDP per person employed as a percentage of the United States. You're gonna see it in I will send you the new presentation anyways. You'll see that Thailand is positioned before Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, obviously, also before China, but behind Malaysia, South Africa, Tunisia, and Brazil, for example. All these countries, or more of these countries, have improved productivity over the last decade, but not so much. So productivity has slowed down. The thing is, in China and India, productivity has actually improved quite a bit, but even in these two countries, productivity is slowing down. So,
just to complement what Martin was saying, we did a little bit of calculation of the productivity level, both in terms of labor productivity and total factor productivity. And one very surprising fact, if you get to see the chart, that you would probably do soon, is that it's true that Thailand has improved over the last decade, and it's true that Thailand comes as a better situation of many other countries in the region. But if you look at the historical progression, if you look at China, for example, China had a 7-fold increase in labor productivity in the 1990s, and a 3-fold increase in the 2000s. So maybe starting from a lower level, but catching up very quickly. Despite all of this catching up, if you compare the productivity of all these emerging economies to the productivity of the United States, or the average productivity of high-income countries, this is still 50% below. So the gap that emerging economies, even those that are growing very fast, have to cover in terms of productivity with respect to the frontier is huge. This has two implications, I think you will see later. One is that there is still room in some countries to catch up to traditional reallocation of factors of production. But for the majority of the countries, this is fading out, as Martin was saying. And so you need to identify new ways of unleashing productivity growth. And it's about skills and services, service sector. And here is the chart.
So you see, Thailand is somewhat in the middle. They also have to improve productivity a little bit, but as Federico was saying, China started from a very low level and increased enormously just in the last decade. Now, why is Thailand and some of these countries, like Brazil, is actually decreasing productivity in the last decade? What is the issue? So when we, as I said, key message 3 was fading drivers of old, fading of the old drivers of growth. One of them was factory accumulation, the other one is shifting the labor from rural to urban sectors, from less productive to more productive sectors. And we see for China this option is actually really not there anymore. I mean, the population is aging very quickly. This is the dependency ratio of the young and the old as a share of the working age population, and we see like in the next decades Thailand is aging very quickly, same for China, but and that's the point that we also wanted to make. The situation is very different for different middle-income countries. So India, Indonesia, still at the lower level of the middle-income bracket. They have still huge amounts of opportunities just by employing their people. And this is actually the key thing they should do to make sure that the youth all is actually used and the demographic dividend can be used. But Thailand has that option no longer, has to find new ways. And just as a reminder, the good news with respect to that is actually that Thailand is employing its people. I mean, you see in a lot of other countries, most of the countries we study, we see actually that the labor force participation is decreasing. So it means that in India, when it's decreasing, it means that there are the thousands of young that come into the market, or millions of young people that come into the market each year, but some of them, they don't go into the labor force because there are limited opportunities. So this is actually a very striking development, and the country really needs to address it. But this, for China, is another problem. So, but still, what can Thailand do? I mentioned that we have a lot of options, a lot of recommendations in the report in which direction the different countries could go. For Thailand, I think two key things that they should address to boost productivity and make development happen in an inclusive and sustainable way is education and skills. So let's just start by very simple education statistics, like the average years of schooling in different countries. We can see in Thailand, average years of schooling is improving, but it's still much lower than in many other emerging countries. So this is definitely a very basic thing to address. Then also in terms of the quality of basic education, really like until the year of 15 or something. We have this OECD PISA estimates, I'm sure you all know those, and we can see that Thailand, again, is not at the worst level across a different set of emerging economies, but still has a lot of room for improvement. So basic education is an issue, but also the development of skills, because I mean, as we've seen, the population is aging, so even the people who are now already working need to find or need to get opportunities to improve their skills, to have training in the job, and this is the lifelong learning process that could be targeted through different kinds of policies, and we can discuss them later. The other thing is development of services, and obviously it's related. If you want to develop productive services, you also have to have the right skills, and this is more at the higher end, like the tertiary education, where you need to make sure that the skills are there. But just a stylized fact on where does Thailand stand in terms of service sector development, and I'm looking here particularly at business and financial services, because these services are those that can make and support even the manufacturing sector, which is so important in Thailand. And we see the difference in the share of financial and business services compared to OECD. And you can see actually all the countries we studied, it includes middle income and low income countries, they all have a lower share of these two services in total GDP. Thailand is, together with China, has a difference of around 13%. So there is a lot of potential, but it's actually again good news, because if you develop them, if you try, they can be a driver of growth by themselves. You can export a lot of new services. India has shown that, but an important point, they can also feed into manufacturing. If you decompose the value chain of manufacturing, we see that many of the products, more than 50% are actually, of the inputs are actually services. So if you develop these services, they can help to make the upgrading in your electronics sector, in the car sector, and so on. So this is another area where Thailand could focus on. And just another illustration here, when we compare labor productivity in business services as compared to labor productivity in manufacturing. And then the bubble of each point for each country is the share of business services in manufacturing as inputs into manufacturing. You can see that, yeah, there is a positive relationship between the two in terms of productivity. So you have the productive business services, you also have productive manufacturing. And if you use business services more intensively, so the bubble increases, you also have more productive manufacturing. So to the upper right, the bubble is bigger, and means also manufacturing productivity is higher. Obviously, this is not about causality, but it's a nice side effect, and if you want to understand that more deeply, you need to do more analysis and also qualitative analysis to understand these channels better. Now, key message 5 was about when you go into these directions, you can also achieve more inclusive and sustainable growth. I think on the inclusivity side, I mean, obviously, yeah, everyone should have the same opportunities. And I think if you invest in basic education a lot, and everyone is well educated and receives a similar kind of education at the lower grade, and they get the opportunity to develop themselves later. And this is not only for the young, but also for the generation that is already working, to give incentives and opportunities for them to move on. This will be more inclusive. And I think it's much better. This is personal view, but I think it's shared with OECD view as well. It's much better than just giving subsidies and in any kind of thing. It can be very costly, and Thailand has seen that with the rice issue in the last year. So if you want to accelerate redistribution, I think there is an option, obviously beyond the long-term educational perspective. And this, I would suggest, would be more through the tax system. You could even think of an indirect tax system, in a negative tax for the poor. Everyone is in the system, it's accountable, and you achieve redistribution by negative income tax. But then it's really manageable, and you see exactly where do you want to achieve the redistribution, rather than through very expensive schemes. So this is about the inclusivity, point 5. Now, the last one, key message 6, about implementation. This is really the big challenge, and I mean, we've talked a lot about the rise of China, shifting wealth due to China, and I mean, the main reason why China has been able and some other countries have not is in the end that China has the political situation in which they don't have to involve too many stakeholders. So it is very determined, target-oriented government. It has a vision to implement reforms, and it does these bold reforms without a lot of resistance, because it's just one party. So obviously, just to understand, this is the fact in China. Now, it's much more complicated in most other countries in the world, and it's also not obvious whether a country like China should continue like that. Probably not. I mean, they should work towards a more democratic system. This is clear. So, but still, I mean, what we can learn from China is still to have a vision, to have a common goal, to have a plan in which direction it should go. And I think this is, for Thailand, also very important. And right now, it's a very complicated situation, obviously. And Thailand should aim to go back to the democratic system at some point. But in a way, right now, given that the government is how it is right now, I think the timing is not too bad to also do bold reforms, but together with still involving all the stakeholders, communicating well to all the different stakeholders, including the former government, and trying to make plans, and trying to make a common goal of inclusive, sustainable growth together. And then I believe it could go into the right direction. And I mean, from the discussions we had here, it seems that the general sentiment is a little bit like that people think that reforms can happen, but I would love to hear more about your views with respect to that. So thank you very much, and I hope we can have a lively discussion.
Thank you very much, Martin. Now the floor is open for discussion. Anyone? Yes, Dr. Somkiat.
Thank you so much for a very interesting study. I would like to ask about the convergence to OECD average in 2050. I would like to ask the firstly, the definition of convergence. Does convergence means we reach the OECD average income by that year? Exactly match the income by that year.
In PPPs, yeah.
Okay. Why is that important? I would like to ask. It's defined in relative terms. Why? It's good to have growth. It's good to have big purchasing power. But if we would like to explain that to the public, what would be the issue? For example, if we explain in absolute terms that unless we reach certain amount of GDP per capita by certain years, that we enter into the aging society, we will have a lot of difficulties because we don't have enough resources to finance pension, finance, healthcare, and many other things, that we are going to be in trouble. But if you divide that in relative terms, that we have to be on par with rich country, it would be a little bit of hard sell. That's my first point. The second point, you draw the 45-degree diagonal line, and I think I heard you say that even that is not, it might be that Thailand has grown 4% in the past, but as country has become more developed and becoming richer, it is increasingly more difficult to grow at the same speed. So the 45 degrees is a little bit optimistic. That you have did well in the past doesn't mean that you are going to do the same in the future. So from the experience, I think we could probably draw a better line using, for example, adjusted for the level of the required speed of growth comparing with the past. The line should show different picture.
May I quickly react to the second point? Yeah, I totally agree. It's too optimistic and it's very simplistic too. I mean, we have in the economic outlook for Southeast Asia, India, and China, which is another publication to this. We have a better model that includes all the different factors to do such analysis. But still, I mean, even though it's simple, it actually is good that it's too optimistic, because the result is, for many countries, even if you are optimistic, you don't make it, which is the case for these countries. So I totally agree. It's not obvious whether these countries are still going to grow as they did in the last decade. But even if they would not make it. So really, countries have to find new ways to become more productive, and this is basically one of the key messages there.
Yeah, that's right. But at the same time, that will put countries that on the diagonal line as Thailand, to be too complacent.
Right. If I may also react, as Martin was saying, we did a more elaborated simulation for ASEAN countries, and we estimate, for example, that Malaysia would be the fastest country reaching high income status in just, I think, 8-10 years. For Thailand, this will take a bit more, like 15-20 years. For countries like Vietnam, this will take more than 35 years to reach high income status. And I fully agree with you that this should not be, quote unquote, sold as if you need to reach high income status because you need to be like, I don't know, France or Germany or whatever. It's about people. So clearly having a higher income, just for a comparison, I mean, high income means $12,000 per capita per year as of now. These are adjusted by the World Bank quite regularly, but today I think that the threshold, the lower threshold is having $12,000 USD dollars per year. It's clearly a boost for domestic consumption as well. So the evolution and the convergence of incomes is part of the transformation process that will lead also to greater domestic demand, greater demand for consumption goods, and greater demand for public services and for quality public services. This does not mean that we only focus on the income dimension. In fact, as I was mentioning before, in a previous report and in all our work, we don't only look at the income dimension of, let's say, well-being. We have developed a framework where we look at different dimensions of well-being, like, for example, the ability of citizens to participate in public and civil life, or the gender balance, or the pollution and the environmental quality, because we believe that all these elements should be taken into account when you assess whether a country is progressing and developing. It's not only the level of income. And of course, this type of simulation don't tell you anything about those dimensions, and don't tell you anything about the distribution of those dimensions. They don't tell you anything about inequality. So this is the reason why we are complementing this analysis with more in-depth country analysis. And in fact, we are now discussing with we were discussing with Thailand, and hopefully the discussion will resume soon, about the possibility of doing this type of multidimensional analysis for Thailand, looking at different dimensions of well-being, and looking at what are the key constraints for growth and options for, what are the key constraints for development, and what are the policy options for moving forward to high income status, let's say in 15 years. So we fully buy your point, and this, as Martin was saying, is just stylized facts that tell you, despite the very impressive growth that you had over the early 2000s, even if you had to maintain that growth, which is a big, I underline it 3 times, even if, which is not at all clear, because the slowdown in China, the international environment, the fact that for example, trade facilitation agreement is not happening now, all these things may mean that actually growth for developing countries will actually reduce. So even if you had that growth rate, you will still not be on a trajectory for reaching high income status in 2050. So this is kind of alarm that we give to governments. We're saying, if you care about reaching that status, you should start to understand what are the drivers of this slowdown. And our analysis suggests that one of the major drivers is productivity. And when you start talking productivity, and I understand that several people that are here around the table come from the private sector, when you talk about productivity, private sector people do understand what you're talking about. It's the better organization of production processes, is more skilled people, is more competition that allows fear of entry and put more pressure for innovation and reduces rent and unproductive activities. But there's another dimension of this productivity that we don't analyze in this report, which is public sector productivity. And so the quality of the public services. This is the flip side of the equation. People will be ready to pay taxes and not protest if they feel that they are receiving fair and quality services from the public sector. And this is something that in many emerging economies we see is becoming a problem. Look at Brazil, for example, where equality was an important goal of the country. You had an emerging middle class, but still people were on the street right before the football World Championship because they don't believe that they're having quality public services. So we just want to warn the governments about this.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. I have 2 questions. One is, when you talk about productivity in this presentation, you mentioned only manufacturing and services. Countries like Thailand has a very large agricultural sector, and I think it's probably very important to talk about the productivity in agriculture, otherwise it's one big missing piece. The second question is, my concern is that when you said that we need to increase productivity in service sector, I think we all realize that that's important. But I think the more important question is how to increase service productivity. And service is a very broad category of, it's not like manufacturing. It's from haircut to taxi driving to tourism. It doesn't mean much when you say service. So you said you study 16 service sector and 18 manufacturing sectors. So maybe perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more about which service sector are you talking about. You seem to indicate manufacturing supporting services such as financial services, such as logistics and transport services. Are these the services that we should concentrate on in trying to achieve greater growth? And we can leave the others like final consumption services like tourism, I don't know, whatever, later. I'm not sure. I'd like to know from your experience, what kind of service sector are you talking about?
Thank you for these comments. On the first one, yes, of course. I mean, every country is different, and there are many countries where agriculture still is very important and should be important. Thailand is one, India is another one. I mean, in India, for example, still 50% of the workforce is in agriculture. So obviously, India and Thailand, they have to consider that in their development plan. In terms of the analysis we did, it's true that we had, in terms of firm level data, we have mostly firms in the manufacturing and services sectors, mostly manufacturing. For some countries we only have manufacturing, but it also included food process manufacturing. So it's, in a way, once the agricultural sector, and Thailand does a great job in this, develops new products within within agriculture, in the analysis that we did, it already is manufacturing. So if you go and look at the detailed figures, we could actually track how good a country is faring in terms of detailed agri processing. But again, like for Thailand, we focus very much on the 6 bricks because they're so important for development. So we didn't do this analysis for Thailand. And on the services, there is a full chapter 4 in the report that elaborates a bit on which kind of services you should focus on and what are the different possibilities for services as a growth drivers. And again, I just use services, but we go into the details and show which types of services can be a driver differently. For example, I mentioned mainly those services that support manufacturing productivity, like business support services, which can be marketing, which can be research, which can be accounting and design, a lot of different types of services. These we look at differently at very detailed level when in the study. Then there is also a general conclusion in the report that the consumption services you mentioned, it's true in a way that the general conclusion would be that maybe it's better, especially for Thailand, to focus right now on those that support manufacturing, because of manufacturing and also agriculture, like agribusiness manufacturing, are so important. So probably the business support services and financial services should have priority. However, consumption services have a lot of potential too, because these emerging economies, they have generally an increasing consumption base. We have one figure, I think you have it still in your presentation, that consumption is increasing, like the share of developing countries' consumption is increasing dramatically. And when consumption increases, the share of services consumption is increasing proportionately more. So there are a lot of possibilities to innovate within consumption services, and with ICT revolution, we have a lot of possibilities there. In retailing, China is making huge, a lot of innovations with through internet and like smartphone applied tools to boost consumption in retailing, and so this is definitely also something the country could focus. Probably it's not something like a main target to really develop a specific service there, but to give incentives for firms to innovate, like small and medium-sized firms. I mean, these are mostly small firms usually. To give incentives to innovate in that area is definitely something that Thailand should do as well, I would say, without having done all the detailed analysis for Thailand.
If I may compliment Martin, you raise a very important point regarding agriculture, and one of the questions that is related to raising productivity in agriculture is, what do you do with the labor that you push out or pull out from agriculture? And we make an effort in this report and in other research that we're doing to looking at how developing countries and emerging economies could start thinking in a more, let's say, strategic way about rural development rather than agricultural development only. Because the experience that we have in many OECD countries, not only the high income ones, if you think about Mexico, for example, is that you can find options to avoid massive inflows of people from rural to urban areas and create opportunities in the off-farm sector in rural areas. In fact, we have developed, we have quite a lot of evidence from many OECD countries, but we have developed a definition of what rural is, not that much in terms of the location, whether it is in the, let's say, the countryside, but more on the basis of density of population. So there is an optimal size of what a rural area is, and we have looked at policies the government can put in place to promote rural development. Tourism is one of them, but there are of course many others. We recently had a study on the possibility of using renewable energy as a tool for rural development, because often the sources of renewable energy are located in areas because of the low density that where we can develop these sources. But you raise a very important point, and we believe that Thailand is indeed an interesting case in understanding whether rural development policies, as I define them, have been effective or not. In fact, there is another project that we are starting to develop, and it will be very interesting if you have evidence about that. Maybe bilaterally we could discuss about that, whether this could be something interesting to look in the Thailand context. Because we're looking at countries, let's say Mexico, we're looking at Korea, we may be looking at a couple of countries in Africa. And maybe Thailand could be a good example, a good comparator, for example, looking at the Korean experience, where you had, on the one hand, a very strong development of industry, but on the other hand, also quite a strong effort for rural development through a number of projects in the 70s and the 80s to promote rural development.
First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I found it very useful. When I look through your presentation and also read from the pocket version, I found that it's have the same message as the paper that presented the Economist 2 weeks ago, right? It's about emerging market convergence to the US or something like that, and you said that basically before the the global financial crisis, the rate of emerging market convergence to the US is very fast, maybe more or less 50 years on. But after the financial crisis, then the rate is took longer, maybe 100 something years or something. But when I look to your presentation, it have the same message. So it's quite interesting in that point. Then I start thinking, what is the cause of it? Maybe, in my idea, it's maybe because of the bottleneck. I mean the rate of the declining rate of the convergence. Maybe because of the bottleneck infrastructure in the emerging market. Let's say like the hard infrastructure, maybe emerging market doesn't have a lot of road and railway and something like that, and also soft infrastructure like institution, which you mentioned about that as well. So my question is more on the reform, because like in case of Thailand right now, reform is we are in reform era and so on. So what is your idea and OECD in general idea about the type of reform or the kind of reform that should be good? Maybe like in case of Japan country right now, that they have like the Abenomics reform on pro-growth, like put more women into workforce or something like that, or maybe like in case of China, where they have more or less like strengthen the rule of law and tough on corruption. What kind of reform you prefer? I mean, in case of OECD in general.
I let Martin intervene also, but I think that the two reforms that came out quite clearly from the presentation were about the education system that there must be a rethinking of the education and the TVET, the training and vocational education system, because these systems are not necessarily producing the type of skills that are needed now and that will be needed in the future if you want to embark on this transformation. So that's for sure one very important reform area. The second very important reform area relates to infrastructure, and I would say more to the soft side of infrastructure, to the hard side of infrastructure. I don't have now on the top of my mind the figures, but we made an estimation of the cost savings that a country would receive if it were to bring an index that we compute of trade facilitation to the best performing country in the sample. And now I don't have exactly the figures for Thailand, but the ranges go between 10 and 18% of cost reduction by bringing the level of different dimensions of trade facilitation to the best performing country in the sample. We cover, I think, 100 countries. The data are available on our website. I will be happy to share them with you. Another important reform which Martin hinted upon is if you want to develop the service sector, you probably need to think about the entry into the market, whether it's possible for new firms to establish into the service sector. And here we have just released in May a new index that we call the Service Trade Restrictiveness Index, where we look at, I think, 16, 17 services sector, and we compare countries in terms of the restrictiveness of entry. And you have quite, it's not a prescriptive one, or it's not a directly prescriptive index. We're not saying you should do this or that. But you can by simply comparing countries, you can see that, for example, India, that one could think is a relatively close country in terms of, is actually performing better than the average in 10 of the 18 services sector. In Australia, that you think is a very pro-market and type of economy, still you have services, I think it was about postal services, or I don't remember exactly which one, that are performing quite below the average of the OECD. So these are type of tools that help countries to assess and benchmark with respect to the others. So promoting entry into the service sector is an important one. And I think that another very important reform that we do not discuss directly in this report, but that we'll be discussing in the next edition of our Southeast Asian Outlook that is due for publication in a few weeks, is the issue of governance and public procurement. I think that I heard this morning from a gentleman from the Chamber of Commerce of Thailand that there is no public procurement act in Thailand. So I am trusting what he's saying. Maybe I got it wrong. But the fact that there is no act implies that you can quite arbitrarily deal with public procurement. So this is
just for your information. It's a Prime Minister regulations. It's a bylaw rather than an act.
Okay.
So it have some loopholes that cabinet can override the principles in the regulations.
Yeah. So I just got this morning, so I need to check the trustability of the information. But I think that public procurement is clearly one important area. And overall, the issue of corruption, how you handle and you reduce the cost of corruption is a very important point. Martin, what do you?
Yes, at the end you mentioned about implementation reform. I think maybe it is more interesting to add on about bureaucratic capabilities, especially in developing countries. And I want to ask you the question about what is the main role of government to increase productivity in your opinion? Say, is there any difference between government in developed countries and developing countries?
I'm not completely sure whether I understood the question correctly. So whether...
Okay, my first point is like you mentioned about the implementation reform, and I think for developing countries, especially for Thailand, we should also focus on bureaucratic capabilities.
Right.
Okay, and that is my first point. And the second one is my question. What is the main role of government to increase productivity? I think like maybe like there is like difference between government in developed countries and developing countries. And could you please like give some examples about the difference between these two?
Great. About the capability, I totally agree. I think many of the developing countries, the capability to implement the reforms is missing. It's not just that you want to have a plan of reforms and then you need to implement them. The issue how to implement is often also whether governments are capable, and for that, I think in the current situation, it would be important to make sure that the more technocratic people would also be involved in making plans for reform, and then I'm not sure about the capability of government officials in general. I've met central bank people, and I found them actually quite bright, and I guess there it's not really the issue that they wouldn't be able to do the proper analysis to make the right decisions. So, but I think it's probably in time it's more at the upper end, whether you have the right people that are capable to have the objective view and to make the right decisions. And for that, yeah, you probably need more technocrats, especially in the situation right now. And for the role of government to increase productivity, whether there is a difference between OECD and non-OECD. I'm sure, but even within developing countries, you have huge differences how a government should and can be involved. In general, I would argue that in a situation where a middle-income country faces troubles to boost productivity, it has the role to identify in which areas they want to invest. And here we are back to the previous report on industrial policies, where the government has, I think, the role to identify some areas, and I think in Thailand it's probably electronics and manufacturing when we talk about the manufacturing sector, but then we have all the other sectors too, but within manufacturing it's probably the understanding that we want to keep cars and electronics, but we want to upgrade there. So the role of the government can be to provide incentives, market-friendly incentives, to develop skills for firms in those sectors, like give grants to have in-house trainings or bring people to this thing, or also to make competition contests where you invite companies in that area to develop new technologies, or to develop technologies that exist but adapted to the situation you need in your country. And then the best few will get the grant. In terms of consumer services, I mentioned there is definitely something where the SMEs should be the target. So there you could have SME competitions where those with the greatest ideas get a grant and they can develop the thing, and there will be growth in their sectors.
If I may add to this, I think that speaking about government capabilities without going into the concrete examples is difficult. So if you think about the role that government can play in promoting industrial upgrading, for example, which is an issue that has been quite contentious because of previous failures, we have looked quite critically and carefully to how different countries, Brazil, South Africa, but also some OECD countries, Finland, the United States, are going about this. And there are some good lessons that can be learned. For example, how you avoid that vested interest become kind of predominant. And so if you introduce a system of incentives, you cannot get rid of it once you realize that this is not actually working. And you can only do this if you put in place a clear system of monitoring and evaluation. And I think that here is probably, I would say, the new philosophy in capacity building, which is not to focus on, let's say, a developed country to transfer a certain type of capabilities that are based on its own experience to a developing country, but it's rather to invest in strengthening the capacity of the developing country actors in themselves doing the assessment of the impact of that policy. So it's providing the tools for assessment. I mean, there is a very philosophical question, and I don't know if you're familiar with this American economist who's called Lant Pritchett, that he looks at what it means to build capacities, and he speaks of something that is called isomorphic mimicry, where you say, well, this institution worked in the United States, so you need to copy those institutions irrespective of the context. But of course, this is an argument that doesn't stand empirical validation, because contexts are very difficult, cultures are very difficult, are very different, sorry. And so the real point is, how do you put in place institutions that are adapted to the context to solve the problems that a country is facing? And this institution will evolve over time. So one of the strongest argument to explain the middle income trap, which has no definition, we don't know what a middle income trap is. It's simply an observation. Countries that are more or less in the range of middle income face a slowdown in growth, and they face productivity slowdown. But one of the theoretical explanation of that is that the type of institution that you need at the beginning of your development process are quite different from the type of institution that you need at more advanced stage. If your growth model is based on factor accumulation and cheap labor, you don't need really very advanced financial services, because this is not the source of a comparative advantage. But the moment that you start to compete, and what Martin was saying, and the emphasis on the business-related services, the moment that you start to compete for moving into higher levels or brackets of the value chain, you need to develop different institutions, different supportive services that you didn't need before. And so there is this evolution in institutions that need to be taken into account. So it's not a static phenomenon, it's not static. So the type of competencies and capabilities will have to evolve with respect to the current level of development, but also the type of institutions you have to put in place are not necessarily those that the United States or Sweden or Italy or whatever country put in place. And this is the reason why I stressed the point that I made at the end of my brief introduction. 3 priorities on the how: developing the right type of institution, deepening regional integration, because this will also bring scale, for example, for financial and bond markets, and third, try to learn from other countries, peer learning. And often the learning does not take place in the same region. I remember once with the foreign minister of trade of Costa Rica, Annabel Gonzalez, and she's now at the World Bank, and she was saying, I want to know from Thailand, from Indonesia, from Malaysia, I don't have much to learn from Paraguay or Belize or whatever, because I'm not in the same league. I'm producing different things. I want to know from Malaysia, for example, how they implement policies to promote R&D and innovation. If I look in my own region, I have very limited experiences to compare. And this is the reason why the OECD is trying to set up these platforms where you bring countries from different regions but are facing similar problems, because this is where the learning can take place. Sorry, it was long. Good. I answered.
I have a question. You mentioned about talking about productivity, and then you said the word people, which I think at the end of the day, productivity is people. It's their behavior, their work ethics and stuff. So I was interested in the fact that when we talk about people, especially in a lot of people in HR are talking about how to boost productivity. We're talking about getting them to do certain kind of behaviors. And like in Thailand, they even talk about certain ethnic groups, like the Thai Chinese, who have a very hard working ethic. Now, I'm trying to look at something about cultures. My question is, how much do you think each culture has an effect on productivity? And that is there actually a sense where some countries actually have, say for example, I'll say East Asia, they have certain cultural values like social responsibility that make them more productive, and they have a competitive edge over, say, another kind of culture which is less conducive. So my question would be, what recommendations and studies that the OECD might have done that might help us to see, how you can compensate for, say, differences in cultural values or behaviors that might actually give them a competitive edge or a less competitive edge that can help them grow. Because you can't, when we talk about peer models, you can't use the same model for every country. Cultures play a really important part in behavior and productivity. Thank you.
Well, you asked me the easy question. Thank you. We don't look in general at the cultural values as a determinant of productivity. I'm sure that some econometrician must have done it, including some kind of whatever, but I'm not very convinced of this approach. The way that we try to look at it is slightly different. The gentleman here before mentioned the Abenomics, the reform of bringing more women into the labor force, increasing women labor force participation. This is an area where we've done some work to see how culture is preventing more gender equality and greater women participation in the labor force. So we have devised, and it was not easy, also for politically correctness reasons, we devised an instrument to look at the role of social institutions and social norms in promoting gender discrimination or in easing gender discrimination. And one important component of this is economic participation. So there are broadly three categories. One is about family code, one is about violence and integrity, physical integrity, and one is about economic participation. And we have evidence now, we cover I think 120 countries, of how different social norms, which are very close to values that you refer to, can actually play a very strong deterrent role from having more women into the labor force. Just give you one example. If you are denied access to property, or if you are forced into early marriage, clearly your investment in education is going to be wasted, because probably you will not have an opportunity to enter the labor force. If you marry too early, you don't complete your study. If you are barred from owning a business, you don't even think about going into a business to say, I cannot do it. Or if you cannot, I don't know, if you cannot inherit land, so in the inheritance code, you cannot access, you cannot inherit. These are all things that are preventing women in many parts of the world from increasing their participation in the labor force, and hence having an impact on productivity. So this is the way that we are looking at it. It's not perfect, I mean, it's not comprehensive, but it allows us to identify what are the root causes of gender inequality, to increase the awareness on those, which is the first objective, so that people start talking about it, and in some cases in trying to understand how different countries are going about these difficult issues. One example, I was recently in a panel with the Minister of Women from Burkina Faso, and she was saying, in our region, unfortunately, female FGM, mutilation is a very widespread problem. How do you solve it? You can have like legal enforcement, saying this is a crime, but it's not accepted by the many communities, or you can have a different approach where you try to involve the communities, involve the males especially, and explain why this is not something right to do. So I'm not answering directly to your question, but I'm saying that I agree with you that culture and social norms play a very important role in explaining productivity, that we, as economists, I guess that many of us are either economists or coming from a related field, we have not paid enough attention to those. It's not easy to deal, but the first thing is to try to measure them. And we try to measure it in the area of gender. And by measuring it, you start talking about it, and you start to identify options to address the problem.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there anyone?
I just want to ask about, since you're presenting about boosting productivity for development, like I just want to get your perspective on like how would you be able to actually promote growth as well as ensuring environmental sustainability, as like you mentioned, in addition to the one strategy that you already mentioned about the supporting renewable energy at a local level.
Well, the report, and Martin may want to elaborate on that, the report deals with the issue of sustainability also from an environmental point of view. At the OECD, the way that we look at it is from what we call a green growth perspective, which is identifying ways of greening the production process, notably to more energy efficient use of resources, but in general, looking, for example, at waste, looking at water management, plenty of things. So it's not the direct focus of this report. It was actually the focus of the Southeast Asian outlook that we produced 3 years ago. And so I don't remember exactly what the recommendation at the time were, but I'm happy to share it with you when I'm back to the office. But at the OECD, we look at the issue of sustainable development, not only at growth. So we do believe that by investing in green, you are not giving up on growth, if I can say it this way. Some people see a trade-off between greening your model and growing your economy. We have evidence that the two things are not contradictory in themselves.
Yeah, actually, I mean, to be more focused on what we have in the report on these topics is exactly that there is a section showing that if you invest or if you have lower energy intensity in a particular sector, you usually have more productivity as well because you use better technology. So this is a general stylized fact that it's already enough to argue, yeah, we should go for it, and it's not contradictory to invest in the environmentally friendly sectors because it actually boosts your productivity. And even more so because the places where emerging countries want to sell their things are still increasingly also in China, and probably China doesn't is not necessarily or not actually even more and more so. I mean, they actually focus also on environmental sustainability a lot now, but not so much before. But definitely in the developed world, that also is importing a lot of products. The demand is also shifting towards preference for tracking how are things produced and so on. So even from that perspective, it makes so much sense to focus on that. And then, I mean, how to do it? Is again, we are back to where to focus, and I think the government has a role to focus on some sectors, and within those sectors, should definitely target a new technology. And I think in Thailand right now there is a big investment in eco-friendly car or eco cars. So it's a great development, and if the government has means to support that in the market-friendly way, it should do it.
Just to add, sorry, I forgot one important point is the issue of infrastructure. We say in the report that infrastructure is a big driver of the catching up process. But for countries that are vulnerable to climate change or to natural disasters, this implies that if you do not plan from the beginning of the infrastructure that the infrastructure is climate resilient, you are going to have to invest a lot of resources into rebuilding this. And so this is an issue that is becoming, at the same time, quite important and quite controversial in the international discussion because, for example, in the G20 discussion that is now taking place, there is a push by some countries to have the G20 endorsing some type of recommendation that would suggest that when multilateral development banks invest in infrastructure, they should give a premium or a priority to climate resilient infrastructure. Because if you take a region like the Caribbean, or some parts of this region as well, it's clear that every 3, 4, 5 years you have a natural hazard that turns into major damages for your infrastructure. You need to rebuild almost from scratch. While if you had integrated into the infrastructure the issue of resilience, you probably would have built the infrastructure differently, and that would have reduced the cost of rebuilding. The problem here is that some countries are seeing this as a new type of conditionality, because they would say, the moment you put climate resilience as an important objective for MDBs like World Bank or Asian Development Bank lending into infrastructure, you are suggesting that only those projects that are climate resilient will be funded, while other countries that may not want to, whatever, will not be funded. And to me, this is a very silly kind of trade-off, because when you look at the cost of rebuilding infrastructure, it makes economic sense to start from a climate resilient one from scratch. But unfortunately, politics trumps economics often, always, I would say. And so the discussion on this very important point that you're making, how do you incorporate an environmental sustainability dimension into boosting productivity, is unfortunately lacking. Only a few countries actually put climate resilience and infrastructure as a core objective of their infrastructure development plans.
May I just add one little thing on this? I mean, there is a new initiative at the OECD, which is called New Challenges for Economic Growth, and one core project there is on the like the effects of climate change related topics on economic growth going forward. And there are projections for different regions, what is the impact of climate change on growth, and it's actually quite alarming for this region here in Southeast Asia. This is the region where these projections show that GDP will be affected most by climate change. So especially here, working in this direction is particularly important, not just for the world in general, because it's a world problem, but to some extent it's actually a very region-specific problem. So the interest to go in that direction is very big.
Now, I have a very important question that I think everybody wants to know. How and when can we read the report? Will we get one copy each, right?
You're entering into a very delicate question of intellectual property rights, pricing. Now, I have one copy that I'm happy to one copy with me, because I have a limitation on the baggage and luggage, and I think Martin will be happy to share with you the electronic copy if you promise that you keep it for yourself and you don't distribute it. So this is for this report. I would also be happy to share with you the forthcoming Southeast Asian economic outlook, because the previous one looked at the issue of middle income trap in Southeast Asia, and it concluded by saying you need to invest in better institutional capacity. And the next one, which is going to be launched in Myanmar at the ASEAN Summit in a couple of months, beginning of November, 12th, 13th of November, will be ready by then. And so my colleague Kensuke Tanaka, who is the lead of this project, will be in Bangkok, I suppose not very much late than the launch. And so if you're interested, he'll be happy to carry with him copies and also to do a presentation to this distinguished audience or another audience if you want.
Thank you very much, Federico and Martin.